online, on the TuneIn app,
and on your smart speaker.
Play Shock Radio.
This is the sound of Salford.
Shock Radio News.
This is the Shock News Show with Noah Buckingham-Reed, Alfie Mulcahy and Alfie Garner. The headlines at 7. Families of the Nottingham attack victims are calling for the killer to be retried for murder. A report revealed Valdo Calacane, who was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and is serving a hospital order for manslaughter, avoided medication claiming he didn't like needles. The Prime Minister's rejected Donald Trump's suggestion that the US should own Gaza, saying residents must be allowed home. The US President's idea to redevelop the Strip into Riviera has been widely condemned. A studies found banning phones in schools is not linked to better grades or mental health, but the research does suggest sleep, behaviour and exercise is worse in those looking at their devices for longer. Ozzy Osbourne is reuniting with his Black Sabbath bandmates for the first time in 2 decades, there to play a charity concert at Villa Park in July. Newcastle take a 2-0 lead into the second leg of their EFL Cup semi-final against Arsenal at St James Park tonight. Celtic can go 13 points clear at the top of the Scottish Premiership with a victory over Dundee in Glasgow.
Shock Radio weather.
Dry with light winds, but widely cold and frosty tonight. A low of 1 degree in Manchester.
If you just click stop on the... Yeah, there we go. All done.
Okay. Shock News Show. So, plenty to talk about this week. We were on day 16 or 17 of the Trump administration. So, of course, we've been given plenty to talk about. Leading the headlines this week has been Trump's tariffs, or attempted tariffs, and sort of negotiated in and out of them. I think the main one to talk about is we've seen the China tariffs go in at 10%, or are set to go in. But we've also seen that Mexico and Canada had 25% tariffs imposed and then sort of negotiated away. What was your immediate response to seeing the tariffs implemented this week?
Well, it all happened quite quickly, didn't it? We first kind of heard about them on Sunday evening, and then Sunday evening UK time, and then Monday afternoon we heard, first of all, that the Mexico tariff had been postponed by 30 days. Then, just an hour later, we heard that the Canadian tariff had been delayed by 30 days. I think it kind of shows the drive by Trump and his team to do as much in these first 100 days as possible. And the logistics are kind of catching up with them as they try and push this stuff through. The logistics and people are getting in the way of their plans. They've halted them.
And a big thing about this is how in the election campaign, Mr. Trump said he was going to implement a 60% tariff on China. He's now implemented the 10%. But it's not going to have... I think Donald Trump, has the idea that it's going to affect international partners, but it's not going to affect them as much as they think it does. It's going to impact the American people overall. You know, a lot of goods are imported from China. A lot of these goods are going to become more expensive over the next sort of few weeks as these tariffs start to take shape. So I don't think it's going to have this idea that Donald Trump wants it to have, but it's going to have some impact on international relations.
Well, it's been something massively sort of underestimated, I think, by people both in the US and potentially abroad as well, and in China, who might not realise the impact that this could quite quickly have on their outputs, because I think the US, what we don't understand, is such a massive importer of goods from all areas, and massively including China, even if these things on Mexico and on Canada aren't. But from China, these are huge amounts of output, and if these are quite quickly prices skyrocket up, it'll be very noticeable, like you said, in the average American's pocket. So we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, and I do think that any possible sanctions on China will have the desired effect of Trump and his administration. By putting tariffs on, it'll drive the prices of Chinese goods up in America, which will discourage people from buying them, and it'll mean that China is making less money from America as a place. But the effect on that is American people who are just wanting to buy stuff and go about their daily lives, the price for them will end up skyrocketing.
I think what we see is that this is not going to be a quick transition. That imports from China won't stop immediately, and what will happen instead is that those prices will go up and what American companies can do is then compete with those prices. So the price of everything eventually goes up too. But China has hit back after the US imposed the 10% tariffs on goods from the country. Not long after the taxes began on Monday, Beijing announced it was imposing a similar charge on coal and gas from America beginning on Monday. What impact do you think that might have?
It'll have a major impact. So what we've seen over the last sort of 3 years is a shift between who supplies coal and gas around the world. Partly due because of the war in Ukraine, a lot of countries immediately sanctioned Russia, so they've had to look at other places to get their coal and gas from. But also part of the reason of going greener. So Beijing kind of has to double down on this and say, it will affect us. We're going to have a massive impact on this, but it'll also impact the US in a similar way, because they'll end up reducing the amount that Beijing will end up producing, and China will end up producing how much it buys from the US. So what it will mean is high prices for people in Beijing, but also different ways of getting that coal and gas, usually now through other Western countries, but also from other people within the EU.
And you don't think there's any chance of, well, there could be a chance of sort of wider cooperation, and the US, as much as they'll has the idea of an isolationist ideal, could actually see more international cooperation on the back of these tariffs?
I think Trump's kind of strategy is attract headlines, make other countries, other leaders fearful, and kind of scare a response out of them. I think that's what we've seen with Mexico and with Canada. He's said this big outlandish thing, which has then led to talks where the other party that isn't America feels pressured into making a decision quickly. I think that's kind of one of his key tactics.
Okay, well, let's hear from China's envoy to the UN, Fu Kong, who said that two countries should be cooperating.
The world is entering a very turbulent period. So as two biggest countries, we don't need to fight each other. We need to work together to fight against the common enemies of the world, like terrorism.
Right, so I think this shows that there could be signs of cooperation. These are, like he said there, the two biggest economies. So if there is a way which Trump can sort of find a way to negotiate through that, perhaps we'll see less fluctuation than we've seen. But again, it's not a follow-through on the promises he made in his campaign.
No, it's absolutely not. But again, you said it, it's the two biggest economies in the world, the two economies that have the most power in the world on how goods are exported and imported, and also how, the effect that it has. So we've seen it with the TikTok ban that was in place for 12 hours. That was purely because it was a Chinese owner, not because, they'll complain that it's national security. Whereas now Trump is going to try and use some of these tariffs in a way of trying to find an American buyer and buy TikTok from the Chinese company ByteDance. So we are going to see these two massive economies cooperating in some way, but it's not going to be in the way that they used to by any stretch of the imagination.
And on Canada as well, I'm just going to go through this, that Justin Trudeau said that the tariffs on Canada will be paused for at least 30 days. So it's not a full, it's not a massive extension, but it will leave them alleviated for a month. But what has been returned for, and I think this might be gone slightly under the radar, is that there is sort of a return here. There's not sort of a simple negotiation and Trump has sort of gone, let's hold this off. He's actually made this deal where Canada's Prime Minister has said that he'll instruct 10,000 soldiers to work on protecting the border. Is this going to be a long-term solution to this? And is this something which could be used as negotiating power? And should sovereign countries have to sort of use this bargaining negotiation, sort of kiss in the ring, essentially, of Trump to solve their concerns about national tariffs? I
think Canada is quite rightly quite concerned about this new administration coming in. We saw in the run-up to the inauguration him talking about Canada as the beloved 51st state, and same with Mexico and Greenland and other places like that. Ludicrous claims, and now these tariffs as well. I think the Canadian executive have made the perhaps sensible decision to be ready in case there is anything going wrong along the border. It is worth noting that America gets lots of its crude oil from the Canadian prairies in a big long pipeline that goes across that border. So Canada, whilst on the face of it, it looks like Trump and his team have the power in this situation. Canada has the ability to turn off a large chunk of America's supply. So they're readying troops. They've got the option to turn off or limit the supply if they want to. So I think really Canada is just asserting that it does have the upper hand here.
And the American president said that he's had discussions with Trudeau. So let's hear that.
We had a good talk in the morning, but I did ask him a couple of questions, like, banks aren't allowed to do business in Canada. Canada is very tough. Canada is very, we're not treated well by Canada.
I mean, what's your sort of response to that? I think there's an element which Trump feels he's owed this negotiation and owed sort of something back from the countries in which he's negotiating with.
I think he has this feeling because of the centuries of trading between Canada, because it's their closest neighbour. It's the closest neighbour with a huge economy and power that they can trade with. So that's why Trump has these feelings. But it's also come at a time where, the Canadian government is kind of falling apart. Justin Trudeau only a few weeks ago said he's going to step down at the next election from being the Prime Minister. So we're seeing this sort of issue where America's trying to push through trade deals with, trade restrictions with Canada. Canada's having its own governmental breakdown. So whether or not Canada will be able to sort of, in the face of it, be able to manage this expectation from the transfer from Trudeau to whoever becomes the next Prime Minister, and indeed a potential change in party in Canada, it is going to be something to see, because they'll have completely different attitudes to the whole arrangement.
Okay, we'll do a last bit on this, just in terms of a bit closer to home, and there's actually not been clear yet whether we will get tariffs in the UK or whether the EU will get tariffs. We've seen that it's happened to countries around, and it's going to happen to countries maybe further and further away. But Keir Starmer said that both relationships were important to the UK. He said that now that for me isn't new. I think that's always been the case and will be the case for many years to come. Are you concerned that it's going to come to our shores and affect us?
Well, when Trump was talking about EU tariffs, he said that British Labour would be easy to deal with. And there are two ways of looking at that easy to deal with. Either he thinks that they're good negotiating partners, or that they're easily manipulated. We'll hope, as Britain, as a country, for the former, but knowing Trump's track record, it may well have been more of a threat than it seems like on the surface. I think we'll have to see what happens, whether Keir Starmer, like previous British Prime Ministers, has been one of the first world leaders, will be one of the first world leaders to go and meet Trump to discuss stuff like this.
He's also going to be the first Prime Minister in a number of years to have an EU leaders meeting.
Yes.
So could this affect potentially how Trump sort of views us as a potentially having a close relationship with the EU than an international trade partner like the US? I think that could also be a concern. But let's move on to what Trump has said today then, the big news coming out sort of last night and today about what Trump has said about the Gaza Strip and how, as I mentioned at the beginning in the headlines, his discussion to sort of ideas to take it over. I mean, what are the realities of this idea? The UN Secretary General Stefan Djuricic warns that in the search for solutions, we must not make the problem worse, and will also reaffirm the two-state solution. Could this be the end of a US-backed two-state solution?
I don't think it will. I think the US sort of having this democracy will have to at some point admit a two-state solution, but Trump is having these ideas of buying Gaza and owning Gaza to make it a massive sort of Las Vegas of the Middle East, if you will. So whether or not Trump is being deadly serious, and he said he is, it's come under international backlash. So it's going to be a way of seeing how serious Donald Trump is about the situation in the Middle East, whether or not he will, if fighting resumes at some point, whether or not he will back a new ceasefire deal, whether or not it will get to a point where he'll have to look towards other states of sort of peace in that sort of area of the Middle East. But for Trump, this is vital. You know, he's just met with the Israeli Prime Minister. So this is vital for him to be able to say, look at this. This is what I've done to help the people in the Middle East, because he's already taken credit for the ceasefire in Gaza. So it's going to be an interesting path to a solution, but he thinks the best way to do it is to buy Gaza and sort of almost risk Gazan citizens from rebuilding again.
And it's that terminology as well. It's that owning, that buying. He obviously comes from a business background, but owning and buying this big portion of land that's home to so many people is such an inhuman way of looking at it. He's looking at it like a real estate agent, or again like a business negotiation, rather than the reality of there being thousands of people there.
Well, this has been sort of the theme of America in this presidency. You can't quite run a democracy like a business, because business are authoritarian by nature. And when you try and run a democracy as an authoritarian, it doesn't necessarily work. You're beholden to the people, not to shareholders. You're beholden not to yourself and to the success of your business, but to the people and those people affected. And that might be the slight mistake that this second Trump presidency is making. They think they can come in, and the types of the tech oligarchs like Musk, who can come in and think they can talk about. We'll talk about USAID later and the issues there. But let's hear from Trump and Netanyahu, who had a press conference earlier.
I don't think people should be going back to Gaza. I think that Gaza has been very unlucky for them. They've lived like hell. They lived like you're living in hell. Gaza is not a place for people to be living.
So I think those trying to defend the Trump argument, I think what they're trying to frame this as is that he warns that moving the Palestinians back in to the Gaza Strip would be too dangerous and too provocative for the Israeli state. But he has described it as a beautiful area where Palestinians can resettle permanently alongside world citizens. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but again, it sort of comes back to this idea of seeing this as a business opportunity or a real estate opportunity, whereas actually this is a sovereign land to an extent, considered by part of the world, and the US have been such a focus on a two-state solution for so many years. Does this officially signal the end, and what does this sort of mean for the Palestinians who are now going back to their rubbled homes, and should they feel fearful of this Trump warning, or is it more we have to trust him by his, judge him by his words, by his actions, not by his words?
Well, we've had clarification this afternoon from the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He's said that Trump's proposal was a generous offer to the Palestinian people, and it wasn't a hostile move. But I think many Palestinians and many families of Palestinians will be worried about whether this means land that's been in the family for generations, houses that were there previously won't be restored, and that rightful owners will lose money. They'll lose property in any sort of situation where the US is coming in as Donald Trump put it, as saviour of that area.
And he's described that he wants to make it the Riviera of the Middle East. Let's hear that.
We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something.
So again, he's outlined what he's described as sort of this long-term occupation, one that he believes will create thousands of jobs and homes. For who that is, that's not quite clear. But he's also proposed that displaced Palestinians should be resettled elsewhere. Again, it's sort of doubling down on this idea, but we have seen sort of a retaliation. So the UK, Spain and France have all rejected an idea from Donald Trump that the US own Gaza and sort of these plans, which he's sort of proposed to resettle its 2 million citizens. Let's see what Starmer has said.
They must be allowed home. They must be allowed to rebuild, and we should be with them in that rebuild on the way to a two-state solution.
So do you think this address from Keir Starmer, which was the Prime Minister's questions earlier today, this might be a hotbed of contention and where the UK's alliances land with the UN and potentially with the EU and these EU powers who are against this, and also trying to maintain this close relationship with Trump? So do you think this affects the relationship?
I think Britain and Starmer are in one of the most difficult positions of any world leader in the country at the minute. We aren't part of the EU, so we don't have their backing in an international dispute like this. We are trying to buddy up to the US, but the Labour government is obviously quite wary of Trump. And because we have these two very awkward ties to these big institutions, the EU and the US, I think, and watching PMQs earlier today, Keir Starmer seemed quite hesitant to to back one side or the other, which is, again, it shows what an awkward position he's in.
It also goes back to the tariffs, because let's be honest, Starmer wants to be on the good side of Trump. He doesn't want to be on his bad side and get a really bad trade deal. But he'll also want to make sure that he's protecting people who have maybe migrated to the UK from the Middle East and from Gaza, and making sure that they know they've got a safe place to go when they can, when they feel ready to go back, whether or not it be tomorrow or in 2 years or 2 weeks. So it's sort of that thing of he needs to stay on the good side of Trump, but he also needs to make sure that he's being with the UN on this, being with international co-leaders and international leaders within the EU. So he kind of has to fight a battleground, which is saying, I want to get a good deal for us, but I also want a good deal for the people of Israel and the people of Gaza. So he has got this sort of fight. So for him to say a two-state solution is what he wants, kind of goes against what the US is going for, but he can't fully commit to what a lot of people in the UN want at the same time.
And I think this story has led the headlines. But what we had earlier in the week was the story around USAID, which is the US Agency for International Development, which funds major projects in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, across the entire world, in war zones and elsewhere. And we saw that thousands of employees at the USAID will be placed on leave from Friday night, the agency says. The Trump administration has said that USAID is wasting money and needs to align with its policy priorities. Agency staff, backed by Democratic lawyers, have protested the cuts, saying they will put lives in danger and hamper national security. This could quite quickly have a massive world impact. And, you know, we've let sort of these big news-leading quotes from Trump lead this. How big an impact do you think this could potentially have?
It'll have a massive impact. USAID helps over 100 countries who either, for any reason, aren't in the fortunate position that we are, where we can afford food and water. And also, it's not just people in a state of war. It's people who are in a state of famine, who can't afford fresh water. It's people in places who haven't got access to clean drinking water. So for Trump to basically say you're all sacked, goodbye, from Friday, really sends a message of what the US thinks is vital to them, which is clearly not international aid or helping international peace processes, because there's many talks of Trump wanting to leave other international aid organisations.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop here with USAID. So Elon Musk is leading this Department of Government Efficiency, dubbed DOGE, and he's got this crack team of people who are looking into every single US department and seeing what can be cut. We saw that they went into the Treasury yesterday, and lots of workers weren't able to get into their offices. Lots of elected representatives weren't able to get into their offices at the Treasury Department because Elon Musk's government efficiency team were there seeing what could be done. And there's a real worry from especially some Democratic politicians that Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency are getting too close to potentially sensitive information. And another thing that's been raised is that the Department of Government Efficiency has lots of power over deciding where contracts go. And obviously Elon Musk has lots of vested interests in many, many different sectors across the US. And he has said that if a conflict of interest comes up, that he will abandon that line of efficiency. But putting someone with such vested interests as that in a position like that is a bit of a dubious move.
A US aid statement said the order would affect all direct hire personnel except those on mission critical functions, core leadership, and specifically designated programs. This could affect employees 10,000 people worldwide. I don't think this is a strictly US thing either. So this was completely shut down. This is billions upon billions in funding pool, but also millions of jobs lost. I mean, well, thousands of jobs lost within the US and outside. This is going to be a massively impacting scheme if it happens. But I think what is more important is that the person or the thing behind this shutting it down is, like I said, Elon Musk. Doge, and of course he had this big story last week getting into the Treasury, classified documents. This is a department set up by executive order. They don't have this authority. And if this is the path that continues to go down, these sort of departments continue to be targeted and shut down, could raise much bigger concern than it is currently now in leading the news. But let's go on to a more closer story to home, because we had a big update on Lucy Letby this week, who's currently in jail, charged with 15 whole life sentences after the murder of 7 babies and attempted of 7 more. But a panel of experts has been leading the headlines this week, who are disputing the judgment made in court. I mean, did you see this story, and do you think this could potentially change or bring this story back into the public eye and attempt possibly back in front of a court?
It'll 100% bring it back into public eye. It already has, because for over the summer and also over the winter, Lucy Letby was in the headlines at least once a week because of this major trial that was happening. So for medical experts to come out and say, actually, she might not have done this, it will most definitely send headlines. It'll probably go back to court as new evidence sort of restarts court cases quite often. But it also suggests something about where the evidence for the original court case came from. Was it accurate? Was it actually looked at by many sources? Many believe it was. And it will also decide, she has 15 life sentences. So clearly the judge who was on the case originally believed, actually, she is a threat. She has done this before. Whether or not she'll do this again, we can't be guaranteed, but we have a real certainty that she could. So to give her 15 life sentences and then for it to all become sort of in question by some medical experts really speaks volumes on how the court case was originally handled.
I think one of the most interesting things I read this week was one of the leading doctors on this, Dr. Shu Li, whose evidence, one of his papers from 1989 was used in the prosecution, has actually come out and said that he doesn't back up those papers which he wrote. And this could be something, the evidence that these doctors, or that these juries and these courts relied on to prosecute Letby are now being disputed by the very people that wrote them. So I wouldn't be surprised if this sticks around. We get some more developments in the coming weeks. But also, we have had some response from MPs, and MP David Davis thinks he's read more of the evidence than appeal court judges. Here's Davis.
I got to the end of it, and none of it showed clear proof of anything. None of it showed, actually, that a murder had occurred, let alone that she was witnessed carrying out any improper act.
So Davis, one of the most, controversial MPs, still sort of there under the Conservative Party banner of those ones left. How much do you think potentially MPs fighting for this case to go back to court could impact the chances that it does go back?
Well, there was a string of child murders about 10 years ago, all separate cases where mothers had been convicted of murdering their own children. And it was all based off this one report that had been done in the early 2000s. It's called the Rule of 3, where if it happens once, it's an accident. If it happens twice, it's a weird situation. If it happens 3 times, it's definitely murder. And that methodology was later thrown out of the courts, and all of those cases were re-examined, and pretty much all of them were classified as a miscarriage of justice. So you say that doctor has distanced himself from his own research here. We could see another situation very, very similar to that, where this expert guidance that's been relied upon in court doesn't quite stand up as much as it did at the time.
Absolutely, yeah. And you said there about miscarriage of justice. It happens quite frequently at the moment, especially with what's happening in the post office inquiry and all them postmasters. But for a nurse to receive 7 life sentences for murder and then for another 7 for attempted murder, it would have to be potentially one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in a sense of proportion to number of sentences for it to be a massive. It will become the massive issue within the NHS for sure if it was to become this miscarriage of justice that potentially is.
Mark MacDonald, the barrister leading her legal team, said the findings are a game changer.
The reason why Lucy Letby was convicted was because of the evidence, the medical evidence that was presented to the jury. That today has been demolished.
So again, we could see that her defence team are now coming back out and are going to fight for this. But let's go on to a local story. So the Manchester Clean Air Zone has been funneled money over the last recently and had more than £100 million of taxpayer money that's going towards putting up cameras and signs in addition to offering grants to drivers to upgrade their vehicles to green alternatives. Has this impacted any of you guys yet?
Well, not personally, no. But I think it's I think Andy Burnham and the Manchester Authority have taken a look at what's happened in London with the ULEZ, and whilst that's been very controversial, they've seen a real impact in the air quality in the centre of town, and investment in cleaner buses, which is already happening, along with removing polluting cars from the centre of Manchester, will really help improve Manchester's air quality in the same way.
I mean, a lot of this comes down to getting more people on public transport rather than charging people for using their cars. It's more about making ways that the public feel like they can have an impact on the green transformation, but also trying to find a way to make places like central Manchester more welcoming and more, environmentally friendly. So a lot of this comes down to this idea of the money is there because of this idea that ULEZ has demonstrated, but also because of a general environmental issue.
So the original plan was to charge £60 a day for the most polluting vehicles. That plan was dropped in 2022 with backlash, with Greater Manchester Combined Authority putting forward a plan that would see an investment in clean buses and taxis. That plan was approved by the government last month. Do you think that potentially we're seeing more unified councils, seeing more sort of devolution? Could this potentially be a big part of this Labour government, a push for cleaner investment into cleaner things in the major cities and in these sort of major unified councils which are coming in the next couple of years?
100%. It will have a massive impact, as the next 5 years of the Labour government will be vital for the next 50 years of the green transition. And Labour have already said that they want to be on top of it. They have had plans in the past, so the £28 billion plan for the green transformation, so they have dropped that, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to try other ways of finding it. So this is a prime example. They've gone from discouraging this plan for the clean zone in Manchester to different ways of finding cleaner, different methods of cleaner sort of transformation. So it will happen in a lot of places. So I know places like Leeds are trying to do it, and other places like like Newcastle are really trying to push forward with this idea of clean energy.
Absolutely, and we'll see the eventual shift to banning petrol cars, and steps like this in London and now in Manchester are another incentive for people to move away from petrol and diesel.
Okay. Just gone 7:30. Let's get a reminder of your headlines. Families of Nottingham killer Valdo Calacan victims are calling for him to be retried for murder. A report criticised failings that allowed him to escape face-to-face assessments and not take medication because of fear of needles. The Nottinghamshire NHS Trust has committed to improving. Donald Trump's administration's doubling down on his so-called visionary plan for Gaza. A suggestion Palestinians could be forced to move away from the Strip as part of a US takeover has been branded illegal by the UN. Swedish media says a man suspected of the country's deadliest mass shooting was a 35-year-old who'd been out of work for a decade. Rickard Anderson killed 10 people yesterday before turning the gun on himself. The Lib Dems have called delays to 9 local elections in England a disgraceful stitch-up between Labour and the Tories. Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner says they're being postponed as new authorities are being created in those areas. Newcastle can move a step closer to their first major trophy since the 1960s tonight. They'll need to defend a 2-goal advantage over Arsenal in the second leg of their EFL Cup semi-final. That was your Shock News Show with me, Noah Buckingham-Reed, Alfie Mulcahy and Alfie Garner. This week's show was produced by Alfie Garner and Luke Jones and has been directed and edited by Aaron Walkden for Shock TV. Shock News returns tomorrow during breakfast.